Students who are late can review the first couple minutes on the video. All right, well, welcome everyone to class. Let's get started. Today we're jumping into chapter 11. Before we do that, the last thing we did last time was talk about our parents or peers more important for adolescent development. So hopefully, especially now that we've got a couple more students jumping in, hopefully some of you wrote a couple notes for some areas where maybe parents are more important for adolescent development and thriving, and some areas where maybe peers are more important. So does anyone want to either take over the mic or also write in the chat box just a couple of the ideas that their group came up with on where parents might be more important or maybe where peers might be more important for adolescent development before we jump into early adult development?
I think friends are more important when it's related to social life.
Great. Did anybody have any different opinions across the groups, either in your group, Daniela, or anybody else? Think that friends were maybe not as important to like socio-emotional development?
I didn't get to talk to anyone because when you start the group, they cut in my energy last time, right at the time.
For that.
Yeah.
So what are some other things that might be unique for what parents do versus peers do in helping adolescents develop and thrive? You can also type any ideas out in the meeting chat.
Okay, I can say something else. I think like parents are important. Like we learn a lot with their example. Like even though we think that kids are not paying attention to anything or teenagers, they are. So how we like come up to solve a problem, how we fix things, uh, how we pay bills, like everything you gotta learn somehow. So most of that you learn with your parents.
Yeah, just simple modeling often teaches adolescents a lot of things that they might not have realized that they were actually learning from their parents. Yeah, very good. Then, so Quinn's group talked about the variation in kid-family situations and that might be more important. So, um, so some adolescents might have certain family situations where peers might be more important or parents might be more important for certain developmental aspects, is what I think I'm getting from that, as well as from listening to your group's conversation last time. And that's absolutely true. It can be really individual based on the adolescent themselves. So, and then another comment here, friends have more influence for short periods of times, like participating in activities or doing things, than parents might have an overall greater influence. So over the course of a lifespan, maybe parents have, or maybe over the course of adolescence, maybe parents have a bigger overall influence, but peers might be really important for certain aspects of their development. Yeah. So I think one thing we're seeing from a lot of these comments is that it can be really different for some adolescents at a specific time. Peers might be really important, or maybe for this specific feature of adolescent development, peers might be more important. So maybe working on relationship skills and in the kind of context of dating, peers might be a lot more important in that kind of context than parents. But maybe parents are more important in learning how to, say, manage a household and pay bills and things like that. So very good. All right, any other ideas or points that anyone wants to make before we jump into early adulthood? All right, one last point that I wanted to point out is that this is also another one of those bidirectional interactions. And in this case, it's more reciprocal and through multiple points. So you could think of it as a triangle. I can't really, so here's a triangle with my hands. So this might be an adolescent, and this over here might be peers, and then this over here might be in the parents. So depending on what's going on, the adolescent might influence the parents might influence the adolescent, the parents might influence the peers or the choice of peers, or how often the adolescent gets to hang out with peers, or what the adolescent thinks about peers. Also, the peers might influence how the adolescent thinks about their parents, how much time the adolescent spends with their parents, things like that. So all of these directions are influencing each other over time. So for any individual, there can be this whole reciprocal interaction and a cycle of things influencing each other. So, and then it also depends on things like school context or community context. You have multiple peer groups in different contexts. We talked about oftentimes high schools kind of like a context bubble where so many things that adolescents are doing are through that filter of high school. But if they have other groups outside of that high school, other peer groups, that can have a big change too. Maybe they're getting more input in certain things from one peer group or another, or they don't really or their peer groups are so contradictory, they rely more on their parents. So there's a lot of aspects of development that there's not necessarily one overarching thing that we can say, absolutely parents are most important for XYZ or peers are most important for XYZ, just because there's a lot of variation in that, which I think is fun as a person that studies these things to be able to see those differences and that variation. All right, so let's jump into chapter 11. We probably won't quite finish with chapter 11, but we might today. Depends how many questions there are. I suspect we might have more questions in this area or more discussion in this area because early adulthood is where a lot of the students are. Some students are older than early adulthood. Some students are still at the end of adolescence, but we'll talk about that actually first thing here. About that change between adolescence and adulthood. So hopefully we can get some good discussion going with these topics. And I'm going to silence my phone. I don't know if you ever hear when it like rings during class or things like that, but I do, and it's very distracting to me, so I'll turn it off. All right, so that transition from adolescence to adulthood. There is one other phase, we talked about this in one of the first classes, another phase of development is emerging adulthood. And so some researchers will call this time period from about 18 to about 30 or 35, depends on which researcher you're talking about. Some do go as early as 25 as early adulthood. Some also call this emerging adulthood. So let's talk about that phenomenon of emerging adulthood. So here, this person has got their PhD, it looks like maybe before the age of 25, so good for them. That would be great if I had got it by that time. But mostly we see this emerging adulthood in many Western countries. So the US, Europe, Australia, emerging adulthood is really a phenomenon in these countries, but not worldwide. This is one of the reasons it's kind of a hotly contested phase of development, because if it's not all adolescents worldwide, should we really even call it a specific phase, or not all people worldwide? So would it be better just to call everybody early adults and then say, hey, we see these phenomenons of emerging adulthood in these areas? So there's kind of some debate about that. It's I mean, from my perspective, how this influences my work is essentially some journals that I might want to publish in early adult development. Some of them will absolutely want you to use the term emerging adulthood if that's the sample that you're using. Some of them will absolutely not want you to say emerging adulthood. If you send in a paper that uses that phrase, other than to say like some people call this emerging adulthood, if you describe your sample as emerging adults, they'll send it back and say, no, we're not going to publish this because we as a journal board, we don't think emerging adulthood exists. And then there's everyone in the spectrum in between, some might not care. So it's really funny. That's basically the only way it influences my work, is some journals will not publish it if you call them emerging adults. Generally, people will be fine if you call them early adults, because that's pretty widely accepted. Anyway, maybe a little more detail than you needed to know. But one of the main features of emerging adulthood is continued experimentation and exploration. So a lot of those features of adolescence and finding identity and searching out, trying out different roles are continuing in the US, Europe, and Australia as people go from about the age of 18 to 25. And this goes back to what we were talking about with rituals and when does a person become an adult. So we have a lot of different responses, 18 or starting college, a full-time job, when you're 21, a lot of different ranges there. And so some of that goes into this. So identity exploration, especially in relationships and work, maybe still trying out a couple different kinds of jobs or a couple different kinds of fields. I have a friend who now just I think they're finally in a career, but they were jumping around to essentially, I think they worked with about 8 different nonprofits that were doing widely different things over the course of about 5 years. So they wouldn't even stay at one of those places for an entire year sometimes. So doing this, trying to explore their identity and work, trying to figure out where they fit, where their skills fit really well. So a lot of this is also feeling of instability. So this might be something that some of you students even feel is a little unstable, like where are you living? Are you living with parents, with roommates, on your own? Very self-focused time as well, so still trying to figure out like where you fit in the world that you're in. So, and feeling in between. You might not feel like you're fully an adult yet, or you might not feel like or you might feel like some aspects of yourself are still very adolescent, that you haven't changed a ton. So these are really common feelings that people in emerging adulthood feel. So some of you students might be in that kind of phase, might feel like you're an emerging adult, you're kind of in this transition, still trying to figure things out, and feeling in between, not necessarily feeling like an adult. So with this, so what can people do to support emerging adults? So again, we're talking about people mostly in Western countries or cultures. So providing people with opportunities to contribute. Let's take nonprofits for an example. So an emerging adult who's come in who maybe doesn't have skills in this area, training them, help figuring out their skills, those kinds of things. And that's hard because businesses want you to do their thing and maybe not try to support you in your human development, but maybe that should change too. So giving candid and constructive feedback to adolescents and emerging adults is really helpful. So that's helpful in adolescence as well as in adulthood. So if you're mentoring or you're a friend to another emerging adult, you're a parent to an emerging adult, giving constructive quality feedback. So if they ask questions about what they should do with their life or what kind of skills they have. The other day, a friend posted on Facebook, what kind of skills do you think I have? And I didn't actually answer, so maybe I'm a bad example of this. But giving constructive feedback, so trying to share actually in depth, maybe that takes some intimacy to share those things that you think about this person, things that they can do well. So creating positive adult connections, helping them build their network, and helping them handle autonomy maturely. So living on their own, paying bills, those kinds of things as well. So with this, this also for adolescents, you can challenge them to become more confident. I think if we do more of this in adolescence, maybe this emerging adulthood phenomenon would be happening less if we realize that maybe adolescents are more capable than we consider, giving them more opportunities and times to challenge and work on their responsibility and figuring out who they are. If they can do that a little earlier, it might make it a little easier for them in early adulthood to not feel in between, to feel like they are a little more settled before that. But with that being said, it's not necessarily a negative thing to be in this experience of emerging adulthood. It's just a feeling of in between is not super comfortable for emerging adults. They don't necessarily like it. They want to be settled, and so that's why they're searching. So with this, yeah. So some of the markers of adulthood that we talked about the other day that researchers look at are having a full-time job, being economically independent, taking responsibility for yourself, and moving from high school to college or like a trade school or your full-time career. So these are some of the things that if you asked a researcher, when does adulthood happen, they would need to check a couple of these boxes. So it's not necessarily an age point, and so this also makes it a little muddy and where emerging adulthood comes from. So my perspective on emerging adulthood as a researcher is, hey, if a journal wants me to use that term, I'll use it. If a journal doesn't want me to use that term, I definitely won't. I generally talk about it in the sense of early adulthood, being that phase from about 18 to 30 or 35 or so. Because I think it is a little more generalizable. We do see some of these phenomenons in the US, but we can talk about that. We can talk about these phenomenons of this. Some researchers have even called it an extended adolescence. We can talk about this within this context, but we don't, I think, need a whole phase calling it emerging adulthood. But now you know a little bit about another one of the battles in the field that goes on and how that has some impact. So with that, does anybody have any comments about feeling like an emerging adult, or things that maybe you did feel this kind of transitional and like you didn't know where you were, and some things that did help you to get to that more settled point? Or if you're not there yet, what do you think could help you? Because I'm assuming a few of you might be in this kind of position.
Well, I remember like my dad always liked to protect us a lot, like always trying to um have make us like have the curfew. We did even like if you're like 18, 19, he always like, no, you're not going to this place, you're not going to that place. And I remember when we decided to buy, like I decided to buy my own car, I asked him like, hi, I really want to buy this car, because I was so used to him telling me what to do. And I think I was like 23 at the time. And he's like, you're 23, we're adult now. You can choose whatever you want. And I was like, okay, so now you consider me an adult? Like, so at that time, I was like, okay, so from that time on, I kind of stopped asking him for things, because he was like expecting us to ask for things, and he would expect to say like yes or no, like all the time. So I guess like I remember like from that moment on, I was like, okay, then I'll do my choices, I guess. So it felt good.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example. So I'm talking about this in the sense of like, on average, these are specific things, or these might be the experience. So thank you for sharing your experience. That was really useful to see or hear that concrete example of making that choice and having that different dynamic with your parents. So thank you very much. That was really useful. Anyone else want to comment on any time maybe they felt like, hey, now maybe they are an adult? Or maybe you felt that way and now you don't anymore even. So any things that helped you feel that you've made it to adulthood? All right. Well, I think that was a really good example for that, to show that transition and that different dynamics with parents and taking responsibility, that independence of choosing own car, that kind of thing. So with that, hopefully you can think back to a lot of the research that we were just talking about. Paying all bills by myself is a point where you felt now you're in the phase of being adult. Yeah, definitely. So here we go again, talking about economic independence. So good. And maybe some of these other things were happening at the same time that you're also able to pay bills by yourself. Really good example. So with this, in other cultures, one of the reasons that we see this here in the US, in Europe, in Australia, is because we don't have as many clear things within society to say, hey, this person is now an adult. We have these different markers, the different markers that we talked about of when someone would consider you an adult. In other cultures, there might be a specific ritual or a specific time or a specific thing that happens where now this person is taking on adult responsibilities, is expected to take on adult responsibilities, rather than it being a conversation of, hey, going to buy this new car. Rather than that, it's a pretty much society-wide accepted point now that now you are expected to take on the adult roles. And that helps a lot with not having this kind of in-between phase, feeling like maybe you're an adolescent, maybe you're an adult, even if you're old enough but haven't hit all of these points yet. So really good examples though. And it can, yeah, I think that's all. So with this, physical growth in early adulthood, I think it's relevant, especially since a lot of you are in early adulthood. So we'll talk about these things kind of quickly so we can get into more cognitive material on cognitive development at this time. So peak physical performance is generally between age 19 and 26. So if you're before that, you have some good things to look forward to. If you're past that, you need to work out a lot more to keep your same fitness level. So, but we'll also talk about that as we go into development through adulthood. So muscle tone and strength begin to decline starting at about age 30. So like I said, you've got to, at the end of early adulthood, be working harder to maintain or build at that point. So mortality is 2 times higher than it is for adolescents. And so some of that's because of diseases showing up around this time. It's more common to be diagnosed with cancer in early adulthood than it is in adolescence, things like that. So a lot of diseases start to show up around this time. You can imagine your bodies have evolved essentially to be able to pass on your genes. Once you get to about that age of passing on your genes, bodies still have designs to keep it running for a while, because having parents and grandparents support babies that are being raised is also evolutionarily adaptable, but our bodies don't have some of the things that happen to our bodies later on aren't necessarily genetically and evolutionary taken out, for example, because you're passing on the genes before that time. So these are some of the common causes of death at this time in early adulthood. Still, the most common is unintentional injury. I was actually learning just the other day from unintentional injuries, like say household accident, motor vehicle accident, bleeding to death is one of the most common things to happen in an unintentional injury. So learning how to take care of someone who's bleeding might be a useful thing to do so that you can help them survive and get them to the hospital. So with that, there are more chronic health problems that appear at this time. So generally, things like multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, other chronic illnesses become more obvious or appear at this time in early adulthood. And so that is more common in early adulthood. So with this, early and emerging adults don't necessarily consider the long-term effects of their health behaviors now, on average. So on average, people who are in early adulthood are still not necessarily making the best decisions for their health that will last over time, but it is really important. So having a poor sleep schedule, not eating regular meals, snacking as a main source of food is really common in early adulthood, as well as excessive drinking and smoking, which we'll talk about in a second. It's actually lower than it tends to be on average for adolescents, but still more than it should be for a healthy body. And then also risky sexual behavior. So these are things that early adults tend to be doing and could be improved for their health. So with this, about 34% of early adults are obese, which is a higher percentage than in other countries. So we're talking about US early adults. So this puts people at higher risk in early adulthood as well as over their lifespan. Hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, and other mental health issues. So cardiovascular diseases are one of the common causes of death in middle and late adulthood. So if you're having poor diet and obese at this time, makes it more likely that that will happen later on. So just additional risk factors to consider. So heredity is also important. So regular exercise, what should be being done? Early adults should be doing about 30 minutes of aerobic exercise daily. And so this could be things like running, jogging, cycling, swimming. Personally, I absolutely hate running, but doing some kind of sustained activity to keep your heart rate up is really, really useful. So finding something that works for you, I think, is one of the best things to do. There's some things that you might like to do those things. So if you like swimming, if you like jogging, do those things. It's hard to get into a workout program if it's something that you don't like to do, if you're trying to fight yourself to do it. So hopefully you can find something earlier rather than later that you enjoy and you'll keep consistent with. So the basic thing is stimulating your heart and lungs is going to keep a lot of these things like cardiovascular problems out, pushed away. That's going to decrease that risk factor. That's what I'm trying to say. And it also helps prevent chronic disorders as well. For a lot of chronic disorders, whether it's multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, if it's something like depression, exercise, and aerobic exercise especially, helps a lot. So it is one of the biggest helps outside of, say, like therapy and medicine. It's one of the most recommended things by doctors. So really good. So replace screen time with exercise. My brother, for example, just recently bought a treadmill with a screen on it, so he could still watch shows but walk on the treadmill. I hate treadmills, and it appears that he does too, actually. He hasn't used it very much, but I'm trying to encourage him to do that. So chart your progress. That can be really helpful. There's tons of apps that you could do that, or you could literally have a chart, an Excel sheet or something like that, and chart like weight loss or body fat content loss or how many miles you ran. So chart your progress, set goals. So if you want a goal to run a 6-minute mile or something like that, set that goal and work towards that. So there's a lot of different ways to set goals. If you're lifting weights or something like that, with just lifting weights, one big thing for cardiovascular health is also to do like high intensity, more aerobic things. So doing some kind of HIIT workouts, that can be really good. So it's easy to find excuses. So I just made an excuse yesterday about working out and didn't work out. So I'm feeling called out by my own slides here. And then find exercises you enjoy. So this is probably the biggest key factor I wanted to talk about for physical development, because it's such a good protective factor for future physical development. So with this, these are the things that we've found. Exercising 30 minutes a day has helped people to maintain weight. Also having planned meals, also weighing yourself. So adding all those things together, weighing yourself regularly, having planned meals, setting goals week by week, and exercising daily or multiple days a week is really going to help. All right, so that is the biggest thing I wanted to talk about in regards to physical health. I did want to talk briefly about addiction, and mainly I wanted to talk about the definitions and watch a little video about addiction. So I don't actually want to read this whole thing word for word because I feel like you could probably read it quicker than I can. But let's read this, and I'm going to point out a couple key features of 2 different definitions of addiction before we watch a video on it. All right, so sorry if you haven't finished reading that. The key points here are that, one, it's complex. Addiction's complex. It's a brain disease, and that's one way that it's considered now versus how it might have been defined decades past. So people with an addiction have an intense focus on the substance, and they will keep using it even if they know it might cause problems. So that is one, and this is mostly coming from brain and neurological reinforcement, things like that. So here's the second definition, and they both hit at different things that I think are really useful to think about when we're thinking of addiction. All right, so with this definition, some of the points that I wanted to point out is that addiction is treatable. Still, we're talking about complex brain and neurological reasons for it, but we're also bringing in the environment and life experiences to have maybe caused addiction. For example, some people might not, even if they have specific genes that might lead to addiction, they might not be activated except for other epigenetic factors like high stress or things like that. Or if you never encounter the substance, then you wouldn't, in that case, be addicted to it as well. So with this, they're behaving in compulsive ways, even though there might be harmful consequences. And then this is kind of an optimistic last point, that treatment and prevention is generally very useful and very helpful, as for other chronic diseases. So thinking of this as just another kind of chronic medical disease can help reduce the stigma for addiction. A lot of times there is stigma around someone who has an addiction, that people generally think, oh, they brought it on themselves, they're causing it themselves, why can't they just stop? Well, it's because they have a disease, they have a chronic illness. You wouldn't say to someone who has multiple sclerosis, well, why can't you just not have multiple sclerosis? Or fibromyalgia, well, why can't you just not have pain? Same thing for an addiction. It's a chronic medical condition. There's a lot of complex reasons why they have that condition. And so trying to be, I guess, more patient and helpful for people with an addiction, which also can be really hard if this is a person directly involved in your life that has maybe hurt you in some ways because of that addiction. It can be really hard to be patient with someone like that as well. But hopefully overall we can talk about this in this kind of way. All right, so let's ignore this and let's go to that video I was talking about. Sorry about that. And I think I'll actually watch this at a little bit faster speed. If this is too fast, just let me know in the comments. Usually in TED Talks, people tend to practice talking a little slower, but if this is too fast with me speeding it up, let me know.
28 years ago.
Yeah, that's too fast. Let's see if this is still too fast, though.
I was a broken man. And you probably wouldn't be able to tell that if you met me. I had a good job at a well-respected academic institution. I dressed well, of course. But my insides were rotting away. You see, I grew up in a family riddled with addiction. And as a kid, I also struggled coming to terms with my own sexuality. And even though I couldn't name it then, growing up as a gay kid just compounded my issues of isolation and insecurities. But drinking took all of that away. Like many, I drank at an early age. I continued to drink my way through college. And when I finally did come out in the early 1980s, about the only places to meet other gay people, to socialize, to be yourself were gay bars. And what do you do in gay bars? You drink. And I did. A lot. My story is not unique. But like millions of Americans, my disease progressed undiagnosed. It took me to people and places and things that I never would have chosen. You know, and it wasn't until an intersection with the law gave me an opportunity to get care that I began my journey of recovery. And you know, my journey of recovery has been filled with love and with joy, but it hasn't been without pain. Like many of you, I've lost too many friends and family to this disease. I've heard too many heartbreaking stories of people who lost loved ones to addiction. And I've also lost countless friends to HIV and AIDS. You know, our current opioid epidemic and the AIDS epidemic tragically have much in common. Right now, we are in the midst of one of the greatest health crises of our time. During 2014 alone, 28,000 people died of drug overdoses associated with prescription drugs and heroin. During the 1980s, scores of people were dying for HIV and AIDS. Public officials ignored it. Some wouldn't even utter the words. They didn't want treatment. And tragically, there are many parallels with our current epidemic. Some called it the gay plague. They called for quarantines. They wanted to separate the innocent victims from the rest of us. I was afraid we were losing this battle because people were blaming us for being sick. Public policy was being held hostage by stigma and fear. And also held hostage were compassion care, research, recovery, and treatment. But we changed all that because out of the pain of those deaths saw a social and political movement. AIDS galvanized us into action, to stand up, to speak up, and to act out. And it also galvanized the LGBT movement. We knew we were in a battle for our lives because silence equaled death. But we changed, and we made things happen. And right now, we have the potential to see the end of HIV and AIDS in our lifetime. These changes came in no small part by the courageous yet simple decision for people to come out to their neighbors, to their friends, to their families, and to their coworkers. Years ago, I was a volunteer for the NAMES Project. This was an effort started by Cleve Jones in San Francisco to show that people who died of AIDS had names and faces and families and people who loved them. I still recall unfolding the AIDS memorial quilt on the National Mall on a brilliant day in October 1988. So fast forward to 2015, the Supreme Court's decision to strike down the ban on same-sex marriage. My husband, Dave, and I walk over to the steps of the Supreme Court to celebrate that decision with so many other people. And I couldn't help but think how far we came around LGBT rights, and yet how far we needed to go around issues of addiction. When I was nominated by President Obama to be his director of drug policy, I was very open about my recovery and about the fact that I was a gay man. And at no point during my confirmation process, at least that I know of, did the fact that I was a gay man come to bear on my candidacy or my fitness to do this job. But my addiction did. At one point, a congressional staffer said that there was no way that I was going to be confirmed by the United States Senate because of my past. Despite the fact that I had been in recovery for over 20 years, and despite the fact that this job takes a little bit of knowledge around addiction. So, you know, this is the stigma that people with substance use disorders face every single day. And you know, I have to tell you, it's still why I'm still more comfortable coming out as a gay man than I am about a person with a history of addiction. Nearly every family in America is affected by addiction. Yet, unfortunately, too often, it's not talked about openly and honestly. It's whispered about. It's met with derision and scorn. We hear these stories time and time again on TV, online. We hear it from public officials and we hear it from family and friends. You know, and those of us with an addiction, we hear those voices. And somehow we believe that we are less deserving of care and treatment. Today in the United States, only 1 in 9 people get care and treatment for their disorder. 1 in 9. Think about that. Generally, people with other diseases get care and treatment. If you have cancer, you get treatment. If you have diabetes, you get treatment. If you have a heart attack, you get emergency services and you get referred to care. But somehow people with addiction have to wait for treatment or often can't get it when they need it. And left untreated, addiction has significant dire consequences. And for many people, that means death or incarceration. We've been down that road before. For too long, our country felt like we could arrest our way out of this problem. But we know that we can't. Decades of scientific research has shown that this is a medical issue, that this is a chronic medical condition that people inherit and that people develop. So the Obama administration has taken a different tack on drug policy. We've developed and implemented a comprehensive plan to expand prevention services, treatment services, early intervention, and recovery support. We've pushed criminal justice reform. We've knocked down barriers to give people second chances. We see public health and public safety officials working hand in hand at the community level. We see police chiefs across the country guiding people to treatment instead of jail and incarceration. We see law enforcement, others, and other first responders reversing overdoses with naloxone to give people a second chance for care. The Affordable Care Act is the biggest expansion of substance use disorder treatment in a generation. And it also calls for the integration of treatment services within primary care. But fundamentally, all of this work is not enough unless we change the way that we view people with addiction in the United States. You know, years ago when I finally understood that I had a problem and I knew that I needed help, I was too afraid to ask for it. I felt that people would think I was stupid, that I was weak-willed, that I was morally flawed. But I talk about my recovery because I want to make change. I want us to see that we need to be open and candid about who we are and what we can do. You know, I am public about my own recovery, not to be self-congratulatory. I am open about my own recovery to change public opinion, to change public policy, and to change the course of this epidemic and empower the millions of Americans who struggle with this journey to be open and candid about who they are. You know, people are more than their disease. And all of us have the opportunity to change public opinion and to change public policy.
All right, so he's getting to his conclusion there, but I think we've got through the main points. So some of the main things I hope you get from that video, and feel free to watch this other one as well. It focuses a lot more on mental health than necessarily just addiction. Yeah, so mental health in emerging adulthood. So good video. I don't think we're going to watch it right now, though. So when we're talking about addiction, hopefully I hope the couple points that you take away is that there does need to be broader systemic change to help and support people who have this disease. And another is that if we can also do something at our own personal level to be more supportive and helpful and reach out to people with this disease as well. So hopefully that helped you think about addiction in maybe a different way than you might have in the past. So with that, I will go and look at this so we see the binge drinking numbers. One thing that I found is that sometimes students don't realize that they have been doing the definition of binge drinking as an example. So when you're thinking about addiction and you're thinking about things, asking for support, looking up numbers like this, seeing if maybe you do have that kind of problem, and then getting support for it, talking to people about it could be really good. So binge drinking is pretty common in college, and then it kind of tapers off over early adulthood. So binge drinking is defined as more than 5 drinks in a row in the past 2 weeks. So maybe at a party drinking 5 drinks in a row, and here you can look at the definition of a drink for each of these types of drinks. So extreme binge drinking is 10 to 15 or more drinks in a row in the last 2 weeks. So if that sounds like behavior that you're doing or a friend is doing, it does have serious health risks. So do know about that. So again, it peaks earlier on in early adulthood and it kind of tapers off binge drinking behavior, but hopefully that gives you some ideas of things to look at. The next health behaviors that we'll talk about are sexual behaviors. So we've talked about risky sexual behaviors in adolescence. Now we'll talk about healthy and risky sexual behaviors in early adulthood. But before we do that, is there any questions about addiction? I know we basically just looked over the definitions and watched that video. But are there any questions that you have before we jump to this point? All right, so let's look at some statistics around sexual behavior in early adulthood. So again, we're talking somewhere between the ranges of about 18 and 30 or 35, depending on which researcher you ask. So with this, at age 18, about 60% of people have experienced sexual intercourse, and then it's closer to 100% by about age 25. So casual sex is more common in the early 20s than the late 20s. And it kind of breaks down into 3 kind of segments. And so this has actually stayed pretty consistent. So this is stats from 1994 from 25 to 44-year-olds, but this has stayed pretty consistent actually. So a third of people have sex about twice a week or more. About a third of people have sex a few times a month. And then about a third have sex a few times a year or not at all. So you might think of your own behavior and see which category you fall into. I think a lot of times, maybe especially in early adulthood and adolescence, I remember friends talking about how much they were having sex or things like that. And it seemed like a lot or a very little or a big range. And so wondering, is your sexual behavior normal? Well, yeah, it probably is. So it kind of breaks down into these 3 categories. About 33% of people have sex about twice a week or more. 33% of people have sex a few times a month. 33% have sex a few times a year or not at all. So wherever you are on that range, you're with about 33% of other people in that same group, if we're grouping it this way. So married and cohabitating couples have sex more often than non-cohabitating couples. Probably makes sense if they're in close proximity, easier, less scheduling conflicts probably. If you're in, say, a long distance relationship and you have to travel and can only see each other every couple weeks, that might limit your opportunities. So preferences for sexual acts, about 96% of people have rated vaginal sex as very or somewhat appealing. The next most popular sexual acts was actually watching a partner undress. And then the third most popular was oral sex in studies. So adultery is also not super common. About 75% of married men and 85% of married women reported being faithful. So I believe these studies, these statistics, it's been a while since I looked at them. I believe these were specifically for married individuals, not cohabitating individuals, but I would suspect the numbers for cohabitating individuals are probably really similar based on what I know about the research between marriage and cohabitation overall. So with this, about 54% of men said that they thought about sex every day, and 67% of women said they thought about sex a few times a week. So the overall conclusion of this specific 1994 study that a lot of these stats have come from is basically the researchers started off, they thought there were a lot more liberal attitudes and actions around sex for early adults. That was kind of their hypothesis going into it, and they came out of the study, their results were essentially that their sexual behaviors were a lot more conservative than they had expected going into the study. So that was the big finding. They were surprised by that. But this tends to be the same kind of trends that we see now as well. All right, so with this, sexual activity is linked to higher ratings of well-being. So with that, that is also related to how much a person wants to have sex. So this isn't saying someone who wants to have sex a few times a year, if they're going to be having sex a few times a week, that their well-being will be up. It's based on how much a person wants to have sex. So if they're having sex about how much they want to, that's going to be improving their well-being. So when you're happy with how much you're having sex, it's an overall positive effect. It's correlated to other positive things like less negative affect, more positive affect. So with this, we'll also talk about, we've talked about this stat. I think most of these slides, we've talked about things on them in the sexual orientations on a continuum, combination of genetic, hormonal, cognitive, and environmental factors. We've gone into this in a lot more detail in previous chapters in the development of sexual orientation. So orientation is somewhat fluid. People may change over time. That's one of the things that we focused on with that video that we watched. That our idea of sexual orientation, and while in the past it's been thought to be really fixed, it's actually a lot more fluid than we had previously thought. That doesn't mean that it's still pretty common to have one type of person you're interested in and keep that interest over your life, but it's also not uncommon to change interests over time as well. A lot of the gender differences that appear, especially in early adulthood, a lot of the gender differences that appear in heterosexual relationships also occur in same-sex relationships. So lesbians have fewer sexual partners. Lesbians have less permissive attitudes about casual sex than gay men, and this is something mirrored in heterosexual relationships as well. So some of the biggest differences here are the context differences. So we talked about in adolescence, it's probably harder to find dating partners when you're in, say, a high school bubble kind of setting, versus in early adulthood, it's probably a little more easy to find partners, but still there's discrimination, and so that changes the context as well. That video we just watched, the person was mirroring the historical trends of how we considered the AIDS epidemic to now the addiction epidemic today, mentioning that one of the only places he could be himself was in gay bars. That's one thing discrimination causes, is putting people in those specific contexts. So STIs are primarily diseases contracted through sex. So this might be oral genital, anal genital sex. HIV is overall the world one of the biggest concerns, even though in some places, in some countries, in some it's not as big of an issue, but worldwide it's one of the most studied and worried about. So Half of all new infections are in the 15 to 24-year-old age range. So this is adolescence to emerging adulthood or early adulthood. So that is something to be concerned with. This is one of the reasons that in some places comprehensive sex education is called HIV education, because practicing safe sex practices for an adolescent who's 13 or 14, trying to get them so they have safe sex behaviors, so that when they get to this age range where it's more likely that they're going to contract HIV, they're taking behaviors and precautions so that doesn't happen. All right, so HIV specifically destroys the immune system, makes it really susceptible to other kinds of infections. So there are some effective strategies at preventing HIV, knowing your risk status and that of your partner, getting medical examinations frequently, having protected sex, and also not having sex with multiple partners. These are some ways to help reduce that risk. So there's a bunch of other sexually transmitted infections that your book talks about, and I think it's good to give you that information. On your exam, it'll probably ask a couple questions about some of these. But with the time that we have in class, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about every single one of them. But here you can see what the STI is, what the description or the cause is, about how prevalent it is, and then this is in the US numbers, and then the treatment for it. So good information to have. Definitely look it over. Here it is again if you didn't read over it in your book, but I'm not going to go line by line for each of these. All right, so let's jump into cognitive development, one of my favorite topics. Obviously, physical health development is also important, but I do want to focus on some of the cognitive health development features of this time period. So, Piaget. Let's talk about Piaget again. One of the last times we'll talk about Piaget actually in the class, because Piaget thought that adolescents and adults thought and processed cognitively in the exact same way. So once you got to about 11 to 15, if you got to formal operational thought, that's where your thought process would be the rest of your life. And so if you look at what we know about adolescent cognition, neural development, early adulthood cognition, and neural development, you might say, well, that seems like a really strange thing to think. Some of this was because of observational studies and not having as rigorous of methods, the expectations they had for adolescents versus adults, so the way they were testing things. But basically, Piaget thought that at this time, between about 11 and 15, you would get to formal operational thought where you could think more logically, think abstractly, you might have idealistic views, but that after that, you have no cognitive change in how you process information. Your knowledge can grow, so you can learn more about how to take care of elephants. I don't know why that was the example that came to my head. Or you could learn about how to play piano or how to run a business, but that the way you processed your thoughts was going to be the same, which obviously, based on what I'm saying, is not the case. So more recent researchers tried to add an additional stage called post-formal thought. So stages are something that we've now really moved away from, but some of the better methods for testing this and observations are still relevant for adolescent and early adult cognitive development. So being more reflective, relativistic, and contextual in your thoughts. So having a problem or a question or a situation. Let's say, for example, you've got to get a new car. So you might, in this formal operational thought, think pretty logically or abstractly or maybe idealistically. With post-formal thought, you might think reflectively or relativistically or contextual. So if you're someone who just needs a car to get to and from work, that might be the context that you're imagining this from. Maybe you need a car to go to work, but you also probably want to, well, maybe not probably for me, probably want to go camping sometimes. So maybe you need something that's relatively good at camping, but most of the time does the day-to-day driving to work better, that kind of thing. So this is post-formal thought, one example of post-formal thought, maybe not the greatest example. But one thing I find interesting is that this is also really similar to the relational developmental systems theory that we've talked about from Lerner and Bronfenbrenner. So that development itself is very contextual. It's reflective. It's relativistic. The things that a parent does for a child or to a child will affect the way the child interacts with the parent and back and forth. In this bidirectional interaction that can have a positive upward spiral or a negative downward spiral, can influence peers, other siblings, the community at large. So I find it really interesting that as researchers were thinking about adults having this capacity to think, adults doing research and development also thought, well, you know, maybe this is actually how development happens. So there's some interesting parallels there. So with this, cognition is essentially realizing that multiple factors can influence any given situation. And so again, this is kind of a stage, a newer stage, but now with Bronfenbrenner and Lerner's models of bioecological contextual theory, I might have actually said that wrong. So Lerner's developmental systems theory, Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory. Maybe I did say it right the first time. Essentially, the systems that you're within, the context that you're within might change you. You can change them. Bidirectional interactions. So that's where we've moved. We've moved away from that stage model. Like we talked about in the beginning of the class, there are some things that are very stage-like. So for example, abstract thought in about middle childhood, there's that neural development, then now suddenly you can do abstract thought. Before that neural development happens, you can't do abstract thought. After that happens, you can. So that's kind of stage-like thing, but most development isn't so stage-like, it's more continuous. All right, so young adults are becoming more skeptical of the truth. That's one thing we might see from post-formal thought, realizing that in this situation or this situation, it might be better to do this, but there's maybe not one perfect car or perfect answer in every single context, as an example. So being a little more pragmatic rather than idealistic, as they might have been in adolescence, and recognizing the power that their emotions might have over cognition. So this is also lining up with the same time that their prefrontal cortex is finishing up its wiring. So they have more capacity to regulate their emotions. So all those things going together. So hopefully you can kind of watch that transition of these cognitive abilities over time. And now essentially from early adulthood through the rest of the lifespan, we'll talk about other specific aspects of cognitive development that you can work on and improve to maintain. But at about this time, you are getting to what your brain can do, essentially. So you can learn new cognitive skills at any point in adulthood, but at this point around the end of early adulthood or middle to end of early adulthood, you have the neural capacity in general to do these cognitive tasks. All right, so creativity. So most people on average do their most creative work in their 30s. This isn't true of everybody. This is just on average. If we look at that bell curve, a normal distribution, on average, it's in their 30s, though some people do their most creative work in their 70s or in their teens. So with this also depends on the specific field that you're in. So you can be creative in any field. So we'll talk about the definition of creativity. So openness to experience is correlated to creativity in the arts. Intellectual capacity is correlated to creativity in the sciences. So if you think about creativity in the arts, I think that's an easy one for people to consider. Being creative in art, making really neat sculptures. I was just watching like a glass blowing show on Netflix, seeing the creative ways that they solve problems in that. I think it's really easy to consider creativity in that kind of context because that's usually what we talk about it. If you think about creativity in sciences, how can I be creative? And maybe this isn't a perfect example for you students, but how can I be creative in the way I do a study and how I get a sample? So there are ways to be more creative, to think outside the box. You can think of creativity in that way. You're thinking outside the box and solving the problem or thinking about something in a different way. How could you be creative in your schooling? Well, you could think outside the box and how you're going to go about studying and meeting all your requirements to succeed in class when you still have all these constraints on you, like rent and work and spending time with friends and family and those kinds of things. So there are ways that you can be creative in every single domain of your life. It's not a perfect example, but thinking outside the box or coming up with solutions that are outside the box might be a good way to think about creativity, and you can do that in any domain of your life. So, how to get more creative. This is especially important for anybody in adulthood because you might have more access to the opportunity to be more creative and try out different things. So being open to the world around you is one of the most highly correlated as well as causal things to lead to higher creativity. So expose yourself to something new. Read new books, art, go to lectures, listen to TED Talks about things that you're interested in. Creativity is also easier when you know more about a subject. When you know what's been done before, you can try something outside the box. Something that you might see as outside the box might be something that's already been tried, for example. That's still a creative thought, but if you learn about how that was done, maybe you can come up with something brand new. So go someplace new, try something different, try new jobs or tasks or skills or hobbies, and write down what surprised you that day. So studies have shown that just doing that, like journaling that, can help increase creativity, and follow things that spark your interest. So for myself, a lot of times my interest gets sparked in specific research areas, and so I'll go and essentially do a question paper for myself on it to like learn a little bit of a background on things. Speaking of question papers, I did finish grading everybody's. So if you don't have a grade, that means I didn't have your question paper. So just double check that. And also look at the comments, send me emails if you have questions on your comments. So following things that spark your interest is a really good way to go and expose yourself to new things and new ideas. And so do things that make you feel creative. So if you only feel creative when you're doing, say, art, well, do that too, because that can influence your creativity in other contexts as well. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about today, well, it depends how long we take with this, is flow. So you might have heard of flow before. I have seen it getting more popularity, this idea and this theory of flow, out amongst lay people, and especially with like coaching, like life coaching. They don't always do a good job of understanding it. So let's get a good explanation of what flow is, because it is very related to creativity.
Flow theory in less than 5 minutes, I promise. It was the first game of the 1992 NBA Championship Series. The Portland Trail Blazers were pulling ahead of the Chicago Bulls when Phil Jackson called a timeout. Michael Jordan emerged from this timeout with a sense of intense concentration. And though it didn't seem like a big deal at the time, he would then go on in the next 18 minutes to hit 6 three-pointers. At one point, he looked to the sidelines and shrugged his shoulders, seemingly surprised by his own success. He later described this experience as being in the zone. Now, players in every sport describe this similar experience of being in the zone, where they tune out the crowd and the noise and the distractions and just play at their top performance. But it isn't limited to sports. Artists and authors, musicians, engineers, composers, they all experience this same sense of being in the zone. It's a strange paradox where time seems to stand still, and yet it seems to be over in an instant. It feels effortless even though you're facing an extreme challenge. There's a sense of relaxation, but it's also intense. You seem more present than ever, but you also seem to lose your entire sense of self. You've probably experienced this before, when you were so engaged in a task that you lost track of time and place. There's a term for this. It's called being in a state of flow. And if we want students to be fully empowered.
So before we go further, hopefully that gave you a pretty good overview of flow, of what it feels like, of the sense of being focused, maybe losing your sense of time, being really engaged, enjoying what you're doing at the moment you're doing it. Put in the chat basically something that helps you, that you've done, or some situation where you felt like you're in flow. I know it gave a lot of examples, or it gave an extended example of sports. That's an easy one, but also, for example, one way that I often feel flow is when I'm doing writing. So whether I'm doing the research and reading and like pulling out information, I'll get so involved. As long as I have like the time and not so many distractions around me, I can get really, really focused and be writing for, even with ADHD, I can be writing for a couple hours and learning about a topic and just put a bunch of work out there and feel like time has just not gone by at all, and be really engaged. It's a generally pleasant feeling as it's happening. So that's one situation that's happened for me. So think about any situations where you've ever felt in flow, and we'll talk about, well, what is flow, what's leading to that, those kinds of things. We've touched on a little bit of that right now. So I've got one comment so far: when you're at a job that you really like. Yeah, so it's generally something that you're doing that you're enjoying. So other specific examples: riding bike or running can happen during riding bike or running. Aerial arts, so is that like silks and like rings and poles? Is that what you're talking about with aerial arts? Just so I can use that as an example. Silks and hammocks. Okay, great. So we've got a couple physical things like running, aerial arts. We also have a job. So Brooke, can you describe a little more specifically like what kind of thing you're doing at the job? Like what are the tasks? As well as other people's examples too. Okay, when you're doing the tasks there as a gate agent. Probably a lot of us have been through an airport and seeing that. Okay, yeah, great. So any other examples that anyone has felt this kind of feeling of flow? All right, keep thinking about it. Cooking, yep, definitely can happen there. All right, so keep these examples in your mind. If you haven't thought of one for your own self, that's all right. Maybe as we talk about what leads to this experience of flow, you'll see that. And I'll tie in these examples as we talk about what leads to flow. So we'll finish this video and then I'll talk about the research as well. It'll touch on a lot of it though. So really good examples, thank you. All of those are actually fantastic, and I'm glad we have a little bit of a variety too.
In a state of flow. And if we want students to be fully empowered to own the creative process, to engage in deep and meaningful work, well, then we need to understand what it means for students to reach this state of flow. Although the idea of flow has existed for thousands of years, flow theory began in the 1970s and 80s when Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi became fascinated by art.
Also, I just want to point out that this person actually said his name correctly. I had classes with him in grad school, and I literally couldn't pronounce his name for like a year. So good job to this YouTuber. Also, it shows a weakness of mine. I can't pronounce people's names, so bad on me, but good on this person.
Began in the 1970s and 80s when Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi became fascinated by artists who were so lost in their creative work that they would lose track of time and even ignore food, water, and sleep. And through his research, he noticed a similar experience with scientists and athletes and authors and all kinds of people who engaged in meaningful work. It was a state of hyper-focus and complete engagement, and he described it as optimal experience. Researchers do not have one single working model for flow theory, but there are a few factors that the theorists have described as being vital for achieving the state of flow. Number one, it needs to be a task that you find intrinsically rewarding.
So let's look at the examples here of what people have talked about. So for me, I talked about writing, we have cooking, we have the job with getting people boarded on a plane and departed. So all the tasks involved with that, physical activities. We've got now another example of painting, physical activities like running, biking, or aerial arts. So these are hiking can be an example. So things that are intrinsically rewarding, these are something you intrinsically yourself, you like this thing. So it's not something you've been forced to do or have to do. It's something you might even choose to do because of your own enjoyment of that thing. So again, a lot of the activities we're seeing are maybe talked about as, say, hobbies that people might do, and that's okay. You might find flow there. Hopefully in your job, whatever your job is, you can find areas where you can find flow in that too. So like the intrinsically rewarding experience of getting your job done and completing those tasks. And I think especially the gate agent one, some of these other aspects of it will come into full focus on why these are important and why you might feel flow in that kind of situation.
You're not going to hit a state of flow while necessarily, mowing the yard or cleaning toilets, unless that's your jam. Number 2, you need clear goals and a sense of progress. It helps.
So this is a big key, and one way to really increase flow experiences in any activity is to make sure you have goals that are being set, whether they're being set by someone outside of you or by you yourself, or by, say, an app or something like that. Having goals and a sense of progress. So in writing, it's like getting these articles read or this point discussed in my paper or something like that. For hiking or painting, it might be completing this aspect of a trail. That happens with climbers a lot too, is like, well, there's this problem on the mountain that I have to climb through. For silks and hammocks, maybe you're working on specific movements that you're trying to master that are hard for you, and that hard for you bit will come up. For getting people boarded on a plane and getting it departed, you probably have a lot of clear goals, a lot of things in that step, through those steps that you have to do to progress to being completely done with getting that plane boarded and departed on time. So there's a lot of those clear goals there.
If you are actually setting the goals yourself. Number 3, the task needs clear and immediate feedback.
So this is one that's challenging for a lot of things, to get that clear and immediate feedback. So if there's maybe a person doing it with you that can give you direct feedback and whatever it is, that can be really helpful. For something like boarding a plane, you probably have a bunch of numbers and names and things that are going through your list, and you've got to get this task done and this task done. That gives you that immediate feedback. One way I often describe flow is, or one way that you might have experienced flow in the past, if you haven't thought of one yourself yet, is driving. Think back to when you first started driving. So learning to drive, the first couple times you were in a car, versus when you started to get more proficient at it, versus now it might be a boring task. So think about that. As you're learning to drive, and as you're doing the action of driving, you generally get pretty clear and immediate feedback. Let's actually take that off the table. Let's say a race car driver. So their car has a lot of ways to give them immediate feedback. They're probably talking to someone who is looking at computer readouts of the car, their race course, and they're getting the feedback from the vehicle. So when they push on the brakes, they probably get a pretty visceral response of how hard it's braking. So they get that really clear and immediate feedback. So think about ways that in whatever activity you want to improve flow for, you can get immediate feedback. For something like hiking, it might be a little harder to get that clear and immediate feedback than as if you're doing silks and hammocks with, say, someone training you on some new difficult task. Or also, say, maybe for running, I know there's a lot of apps for running. There probably is for hiking too, to give you more clear and immediate feedback, like your times, your breakdowns, heart rate, things like that can be good examples of clear and immediate feedback.
To know what you're doing and where you're going. Number 4, the challenge must match the perceived skills.
So this is one of the biggest aspects of flow, and what a lot of the people who talk about flow in a sense of like life coaching and whatnot, a lot of them miss, not all of them. Some of them have a really good sense and understanding of flow. But I do see a lot of mistakes in this area from people who hear about flow and they're like, oh, it's nice. They think of like water flowing. It's so nice and gentle. It's a relaxing thing. No, it's not actually. If you're in flow, it has to match your skill level and your challenge. So going back to the you learning to drive example, there's probably no way you were in flow when you were first learning that, because the challenge of driving was so beyond your skill at that point. You're stressed out, you're anxious, you can't do it. Versus now, just general driving to the store or to school or something like that is really easy for you. You might be texting at the same time as doing it. So it's so easy that you're not going to be in a state of flow because it's not challenging. But if you went to a race course and tried to match your challenge to your skill level in, say, driving, you would probably then be in a flow state in that case. So it is something where you have to be intensely involved in it. For aerial arts, you have maybe a mentor or an instructor teaching you something new. It's challenging for you, but it's at about the same level of your skill and ability. For running, you're trying to make a new goal. You're challenging yourself. So it is hard, but you are enjoying it through that process. That's what we're talking about here. You're meeting that challenge and your skill level are matched. So if we go actually to this, that's the main thing that this graph is talking about, is high arousal with that high challenge, high skill level when you're matched. So if you have really low skill level and a really low challenge, you might be in flow. If you are a race car driver, then you probably won't get into flow unless you are in a pretty difficult race course or a pretty difficult race, because your skill level is so high, you need a high challenge to meet that. If you are just starting to cook, you might feel a state of flow when you have a very small cooking challenge. For myself, I get anxiety from cooking a lot of the time when it's a little more complicated. So I need a very low challenge level to meet my skill level for cooking. But if you're pretty good, maybe you're at here in skill level, you need to be meeting that challenge level to your skill. And that's one key piece that I think a lot of people don't realize. It does have to be a challenge. It has to be a challenge for you, but it's not beyond what you can do. It's like a little stretch. So if you think of this in the sense of scaffolding, you're kind of scaffolding yourself. You're using those goals and feedback and things to help scaffold you to the next stage of the development of that task. This is why, as you started to learn to drive, for any of you who do, at the beginning, you probably had such a high challenge and you had very low skill, you were anxious about it. Then maybe, I don't know, 6 months, a year into driving, you might get in flow when driving and really enjoy the task. And now your skill is maybe up here and your challenge generally is pretty low. So you might be bored when driving. So same thing for even doing silks or boarding people on a plane, when it's maybe, there might be times when doing that job of boarding people onto a plane, there's just too many things going wrong, too high of a challenge, and it might make you anxious. Versus if it's meeting your skill, if the challenge is there, you're able to do it, you're able to do it well, you might get in that state of flow. If your skill increases too far beyond the challenges that you're faced with, even doing that thing that you used to get flow in might make you bored now. So you've got to, if you're working on being in flow, meeting that challenge and skill. Oh no, we've got another point and very little time in class.
Required a sense of personal control or agency over the task. In 1987, researchers published the 8.
So this is another, this is that same graph. Here it's saying that this was basically the middle point of the previous graph. But it's saying if you have low skill level and low challenge, you might be apathetic. You need to have a meeting skill level and challenge level. So it's just adding some other emotions or things that you might experience if you're at too low of a skill level for your or too low of a challenge level for your skill.
Channel model of flow shown here, and notice that if a task is too easy, you might experience apathy or boredom, but if a task seems too hard, you'll be anxious. The goal is to match both the skill level and the task at hand. And number 5, it requires intense focus on the present moment. So
with that intense focus on the present moment, I mentioned earlier that when I'm writing, if I get distracted, it can pull me out of flow, or I can have a really hard time getting into flow. That's one reason, for example, I write if I know I have a really big chunk and I want to get into flow doing it, I'll actually start writing after like my kids have gone to bed, so that I have hours that I can focus on it and not have distractions like, hey, I need a snack from the cupboard or something. Like, that's good. Like, I'm glad I can help get them a snack. But if I want to be in flow, I have to change my environment. And so same things with a lot of these other activities. So aerial arts, you need to have a time where you can focus on that. And you'd be focusing on that for cooking or running or biking or climbing or hiking. Some of the specific areas, I want to mention this before we are done, where flow has been studied, or at least in the beginning, were chess players. And because that was actually a really easy way to match skill and challenge, is taking chess players who are ranked already. So if you put a chess player and rank them at someone just a little bit above their skill level, they will more likely be in flow. If you rank them with someone who's far below their skill level, they will tend to be bored. If you rank someone with someone way higher than their skill level in a game of chess, they probably won't get in flow either. They'll be anxious. So this is one of the ways that we've been able to manipulate that variable and check that. Video games actually do this a lot to get people into flow, so they keep playing and they keep buying things for a game. So especially online games, say shooter games. I'm thinking of games like, what's it called, Destiny or Halo. Will try to match you up with people at about your same skill level, so you get that sense of flow as you're playing the game. A lot of online games do this, try to rank you so that you're playing with people who are about your challenge level, because if you're engrossed in the task, if you keep on playing, you'll be a little more likely to maybe buy things like loot boxes or things like that to meet the next challenges. So hopefully this gave you a better idea of flow. We'll probably come back to this the beginning of next class too, because there's a couple other points that I didn't get to, but we're done with class today. Time is over. So thank you for being here today, and we'll talk about this more next time.